Premise 1. If there is a God, he is perfectly loving, something I'm pretty sure Jonathan agrees with.
To be sure, perfectly loving is redundant. A loving God is no different than a perfectly loving God. You can safely drop the perfectly part. But a God doesn't have to be loving in order for it to exist. This is just simply the type of God we all desire to exist. This is because a God that doesn't love us is not worthy of our love.
Premise 2. If a perfectly loving God exists, non-resistant non-belief does not occur. Premise 3. Non-resistant non-belief does occur. 4. Therefore, no perfectly loving God exists, and the conclusion from the first premise is that therefore there is no God. A loving God, like the Christian God, would surely not refuse any willing person from developing a relationship with him, and so if somebody is truly non-resistant and open to receiving God's grace, we should expect them to receive it. Thus, Schellenberg's assertion that if God exists, then non-resistant non-belief does not exist. The question, then, is there such a thing as non-resistant non-belief, a non-resistant non-believer?
There's really no need to account for non-resistant non-belief. For starters, every believer was once a non-resistant non-believer. You admit this to be the case when you say that a loving God will surely not refuse a willing person. So clearly, non-resistant non-belief occurs at least once in everyone's lives, and this itself does not deny the existence of a loving God. To argue that a non-resistant non-believer, when faced with knowledge of God, will continue to be a non-believer, is to argue that a non-resistant is equal to being resistant. After all, is it not your argument that we should expect a non-resistant non-believer to receive God? Why do you now conveniently expect a non-resistant non-believer to resist God? So, by your own assumptions, we're forced to admit that a non-resistant non-believer will only ever come to believe when presented with knowledge of God. Which is to say, those who do not come to believe must, by necessity, be a resistant non-believer. Therefore, since you have yet to come to believe, you prove yourself to be resistant by your own assumptions.
Of course, you cannot know my heart. You can't know if I'm truly as non-resistant as I claim, but I hope that my actions here might betray me.
At this point, he goes through a laundry list of things to suggest that he made great efforts to be non-resistant. In order to prove non-resistance, you must show that this laundry list is unique to non-resistance. However, that laundry list is not unique to a non-resistant non-believer. Resistant non-believers have an equivalent laundry list. Therefore, he is no different than any other non-believer. To them, if a God were to exist, it would be a God that meets their expectations. They fail to find said expectations in any existing religion, therefore, a God cannot possibly exist. Yet, somehow, their expectations of humans are always met, and that would include the existence of a loving person. The irony is not lost on me. To insist that God must meet your expectations, especially when your expectations are absurd, is by definition resistant. And this resistance is caused by extremely arbitrary and loosely defined notions of love. Having flawed expectations is a you problem, not a God problem. After all, why hold a debate if you are non-resistant?
Finally, then, the third fact of our universe, which is gratuitous suffering. Gratuitous here means something like unjustified or unwarranted or meaningless. I do this because it's easy to see how some instances of suffering may be beneficial in certain circumstances or necessary to bring about some desirable state of affairs, some desirable end. But the existence of meaningless or unnecessary suffering does seem to be incompatible with the existence of a God who loves us and has the power to prevent it from happening. We're sometimes told that God has morally sufficient reason to allow suffering to exist. Indeed, if God is good, then he must have such sufficient reason. Perhaps suffering is necessitated by human free will. Perhaps suffering helps to develop a person's moral character, or maybe it's necessary to achieve some other end that God wishes to bring about. But intuitively, there appear to be instances of suffering that cannot serve any such end. And if even one example of these turns out to be an actual case of unnecessary or meaningless suffering, this would be enough to cause a problem.
Keep in mind, this is the same person that claims that the problem of evil argument is an S-tier argument against the existence of God.
Problem of evil is going in the S tier.
Which is why later in this video he alludes to it. Never mind the fact that the notion of evil is meaningless without a God or some kind of absolute authority. But by alluding to the problem of evil, It means he most likely believes that a loving God would never send anyone to hell. Yet, love hates evil while also loving mercy. Love does not tolerate evil. Anything less than hatred is tolerance. Therefore, anything less than hell is tolerance. Therefore, love demands for hell. Surely this is not outside of one's expectations of love. Imagine claiming moral superiority while also tolerating evil. Talk about being self-refuting. Nevertheless, hating evil and loving mercy are mutually exclusive. One must be postponed for the other one to function. If you spend 100% of the time criticizing everything, then you're spending 100% of the time resolving nothing. In the same way, if you spend 100% of the time hating, then you spend 100% of the time withholding mercy. If love hates evil and loves mercy, surely reconciling these mutually exclusive things must be within your expectations. The biblical God's approach is to set a later date for judgment. Having a later date for judgment is not incompatible with a loving God. Mercy, therefore, prevails before the day of judgment, after which hatred prevails by sending people to hell. Perfectly logical, therefore loving.
Keep in mind that, in other words, I'm not arguing that theism can offer no account of these kinds of situations and sufferings, though I am skeptical that it can. I'm only arguing that assuming that theism is false offers a better account of it than assuming that theism is true. Assume atheism, assume that human beings and other animals are nothing more than evolved creatures who developed pain receptors to make them more prone to avoiding the menial and great sufferings that upset our survival prospects. On this account, the existence of all suffering, small and great, is not only explained, but expected. Thus, atheism offers a better account, in my view.
Pain serving as a warning sign is not outside the realm of expectation for theism. That is very convenient of you to assume that it is incompatible with theism, especially considering that in order to assume such a thing for naturalism requires presuppositions founded on wishful thinking. A loving God implementing pain for the sake of survival is not only fully within the realm of expectations, but also requires a God for it to exist. Just because pain happens to occur within other context is in no way contrary to a loving God. You continue to provide reason to believe that you are being deliberately resistant. This same person even resists accepting the argument that necessitates the existence of God.
So theists will want to say that everything in the universe, every contingent thing that could have been this way, could have been that way, it exists because God made it that way. God is the necessary thing at the basis, at the foundation of reality. Now, it's my supposition that a necessary thing cannot be the sufficient reason or the sufficient cause of a contingent thing. There can't be a necessary cause for a contingent thing. Because to say something is necessary is to say it has to be true. If something's necessarily true, it cannot be false. 2 and 2 is 4. That's true, and it can't not be true. That curtain is red. That's true, but it could have not been true. It's a different kind of truth. Right? There's truth which could have not been true, and there's truth which have to be true. Necessary truth means it has to be true. There's no way it can be false. Now, suppose you have a necessary thing. We'll call it X. That necessary thing causes Y. If X causes Y, then as long as X is necessarily true, well, Y has to be necessarily true as well. Because if it's the case that if X, then Y, then as long as X is true, Y is going to be true. And so if X is necessarily true, that means it's always true, it can't be false. Y can't be false either. But what this argument wants to say is that you have a necessary truth which causes a contingent thing. So something which had to be true, causing something which could have been false.
Until trying to prove non-resistance, you ended up proving resistance. Therefore, any civilization that takes on atheistic worldviews are by definition resistant non-believers.